Meetings will recognize Tim Mulligan as one of their popular speakers. Tim is a native of Baltimore. Where is he? Here he is. Native of Baltimore, got his PhD from the University of Maryland, has written 3 books and 20 articles. I have that right. He served his career in the National Archives and now works as a volunteer there. The story that he's going to be telling you about the German Naval Archives is actually fascinating, and but I will not spoil it. So, Tim Mulligan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very kind introduction. This is a very, not even a low-tech presentation. This is a no-tech presentation. The only thing I have are some props, but that minimizes the likelihood of problems with pointers and problems and such. And this is a description of records. I'm going to mention some incidents and stories as well, but mostly I'm talking about the records. And how many of you know, I know some of you certainly do, how many of you know that we have at College Park, Maryland, basically the intact operational World War I German Navy archives? Okay, but now more of you will know that that's what we have there. And for the last 6 or 7 years in particular of my tenure at the archives as an archivist, I was working very heavily on the World War I German Navy records, trying to get some descriptions prepared to facilitate access. And in the almost 7 years since I retired, I've continued to do that, and working exclusively on the World War I German Navy records and access to them through finding aids. So today I'm just going to give you something of an overview of that documentation, and in particular I want to talk about recent developments regarding descriptions of German naval airships and the German Naval Air Service, since we are World War I Aviation Society talking here today. I need to start with a brief summary of what happened to the German Navy records that we have them today and why they're in the state that they're in. From 1941 to 43, German Navy records, the Navy archives, had been in Berlin, but with the increasing bomber raids on Berlin, the German Navy headquarters decided it's time to move these out to a safe place. And so they selected Castle Tambach in Coburg, Germany, in northern part of Bavaria. And in doing so, they saved their records from the fate of the World War I Prusso-German Army records, which remained in Potsdam, and which were almost entirely burned in 2 successive RAF raids on Potsdam in 1945. Coburg was liberated by elements of the U.S. Third Army in April of 45, but the unit that got to the Navy records was the British Naval Intelligence Unit, 30AU. They're the ones who seized those records and organized their return to Britain. Now, in 1944, there had been an agreement between the United States and Great Britain, tentatively dividing exploitation of captured German records. No one realized how many records they were going to capture. But in 1944, the agreement was the U.S. Army is going to get first dibs on anything that's German Army related. Great Britain will get first choice on all Luftwaffe and German Navy records. So when the 30AU unit found these treasure troves of German Navy archives, both world wars, since the Germans were sending their records that were being created and being shipped back for storage to Berlin, Berlin authorities decided, let's send them to Coburg as well. Therefore, there was this huge amount of records that was brought back to London for exploitation there. Now, when the records arrived in London, the British basically kept them in their organizational hierarchy. Because German Navy archivists had arranged these records, for quite some time. The British really didn't care how they'd been arranged, but they kept that arrangement intact. They never noted what the file designations were, but they simply assigned new file designations to all of them as they arrived. And following the British system, there was a registry number, a successive sequential registry number assigned to each file with the prefix PG. So if you see the designation PG and a 5-digit number, that's a German Navy file, but the PG stands for pinched from the Germans. Has no intrinsic value or meaning other than that. Now, in the summer of '45, the Navy, U.S. Navy, arranged with the Royal Navy to film as many operational German Navy records as possible. Again, both World Wars. And as they were made available, British agreed to the procedure but said, we have the first right of exploitation, therefore, as we finish with the records, we'll make them available to you to film. And that's what the U.S. Navy did. They set up a microfilm project in London that ran from August 1945 to July 1947. And in that space, they filmed over 4,000 rolls of microfilm. Each roll, 1,000 to 1,200 images. So it's a pretty intact collection of German Navy records. Of that total, about 1,660 represent World War I and prior records, previous records. They actually date back to 1822. I didn't know that. In fact, the U.S. Navy, when they cataloged them, said they go back as far as 1850. Actually, no, they go back to Prussian Navy records going to 1822. Now, when the U.S. Navy did the filming, they could not afford to maintain the organizational integrity that at least the British had done in setting up the PG system. They had to film the material as it became available. They had multiple microfilm machines running. So as files came out for use, for example, let's say, as I'll talk about later, an 11-volume collection on the subject of air operations, World War I, by the Admiralty, the Admiralty staff. Well, we've got 3 machines. All right, we'll just send these 3 volumes to this machine, these 3 to this one, and 2 to this machine. The result was the numbering of the microfilm rolls subsequently destroyed all attempts to maintain integrity. The U.S. Navy set up 2 kinds of finding aids to try to have some kind of control over this after the filming was done. First, they did a listing, roll by roll by roll, of what was reproduced on the rolls. As you can imagine, with 4,000 plus rolls, this is hundreds and hundreds of pages of listings. What they would put was the file title or a subject, a perfunctory description, sometimes 2 or 3 words, and a date span. The German command designations were translated into English. They were not well translated. So when you look at them, you really have no idea what command you're actually talking about, simply by looking at the description. There is no indication of what agency or organization created the records. And the result is the list is useless. Unless you come to the list with a question, I wonder what's on roll 2,787 of this collection. Then you can go to the list and know exactly what's on that roll. How many researchers come in with that kind of question? You don't. The second kind of finding aid the Navy came up with was 3 by 4 inch index sheets. They weren't even cards. They were just cut pieces of paper. Alphabetically by name of warship or command or organization. And underneath the title, the PG number, and the roll number. And this is very much geared toward war diaries, because given this mass of material, and given the lack of control you had over it, the most important thing to find out was, what war diaries do we have? What do we have for the Bismarck? What are the war diaries we have? What are the war diaries for the individual U-boats? for the command, BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, for World War II. For World War I, what do we have for the High Seas Fleet Command, for the individual battleships and so forth. So that was the focus in creating these little index sheets. When they got to things like subject correspondence files, which have a huge amount of information, they really didn't bother. They just said, well, Admiralstab correspondence. And that was it. That was the only description they had. The result is the finding aids created by the Navy became the basis for everybody's knowledge of what's in those records, the foundation for our own finding aids at the National Archives after the Navy transferred those records to the archives during the period 1967 to 72. There was no attempt, again, made to understand the structure of the records according to German Navy organizations. And no one even thought about what was the original German filing scheme. Because again, the German archivists had created a scheme for these records and arranged them according to a reason. And none of that had been taken into account at any point in the game. The most important result, I would argue, is that research into the German Navy, either World War, but let's just take World War I, has resulted in an overemphasis on the most accessible records, the war diaries, and therefore on German Navy operations, with much less emphasis on the context in which those operations took place. The policy debates, planning, the evaluation of operations that are more typically documented in these broad subject correspondence files of the headquarters organizations, but for which we don't have any real records descriptions. Now, one partial exception, and historians have followed this, one partial exception is the book, which is kind of the Bible of the German Naval Airship Service in English, Douglas Robinson's The Zeppelin in Combat. How many are familiar? Yes, yes, of course. This book was based on Robinson's research in the original German records. He used them while they were still in England. He didn't use the ones we had on microfilm. He used them in England before they were restituted to the West German archives. And therefore, you can tell from his text, he's worked in material from those subject correspondence files to complement what's in the war diaries. The only problem is, Mr. Robinson didn't cite any of the German Navy records. He just gives a blanket statement in his bibliography saying, I relied mostly on the Tombach archives here in all these different files. And that's it. He does provide precise footnotes for every single English language source, whether primary or secondary, that he used, but never a footnote to any of the multiple German Navy sources that he used, which would have been a boon and a godsend not only to researchers today, but to myself, because I certainly could have used that kind of guidance in going through these records, unfortunately. And consider this. This is a great book. What do we have in the way of a counterpart for the German Naval Air Service, the fixed-wing naval units, fixed-wing aircraft units? Nothing. Nothing comparable. So my function, both as a professional archivist working for the National Archives and now as a volunteer, has been to try to fill in this gap with some new descriptions and finding aids. And the most important result so far has been this, which was a finding aid, selected records of the Imperial German Navy relating to World War I, which summarized a lot of the work I'd done those last years before I retired, plus the work I'd done as a volunteer in the first couple of years. Published in 2008, covers about 850 rolls of the 1,650 of World War I German Navy records. It includes all those records that have been identified for naval airships and fixed-wing naval aircraft. There are two sections in here. It's only about 15 pages in this guide that covers the German Navy air records. And they only amount to about 90 to 95 roles, at least so far that we've identified, out of that volume, that universe that I've mentioned. So it is more or less manageable. The majority of the roles that I described are the war diaries. Again, that was a focus since everybody's used to that. That's the first thing everybody asked for. And that is the most concrete thing you can grab hold of and turn to, the war diaries. Okay, so the majority of the records described in here are the war diaries, which includes nearly every individual naval airship that served in World War I, and every airship command in World War I, as well as all fixed-wing aircraft commands, naval air stations, and even the training schools. So it is a pretty comprehensive listing of what we have here. You can do this kind of history for the German Naval Air Service that has not yet been done. But the majority of the guide, as opposed to the roles that are described in the guide, is devoted to descriptions of those subject correspondence files of the headquarters organizations, because they're the ones that have been neglected up to this point, and those are the ones that people need to know about for future research. If you're familiar with German history, or German Navy history in particular, you know that the German Navy, following Alfred von Tirpitz's decline beginning in 1912, the German Navy was very much a decentralized command structure. Kaiser wanted to keep all decisions and power for himself, but being a weak individual, he kind of ceded power to multiple authorities that existed as Tirpitz declined in influence. And during World War I, at least 4 separate headquarters vied for control of the German Navy, its policies, personnel, and operations. The Reichsmarineramt, literally the Reich Naval Office, roughly equivalent to the Department of the Navy, had been Tirpitz's center of power during the pre-war era, but much less so in World War I period itself. Second, the Kaiserliches Marinekabinett, the Imperial Naval Cabinet, which was most closely linked to the Kaiser and was directly in control of personnel issues. The High Seas Fleet Command, which had direct control over fleet operations and which operated kind of autonomously whenever it wanted to in the matter of policy. And finally, the Admiralstab der Marine, or the Admiralty Staff, which was responsible for operational planning and which maintained the operational archives for the Navy as the war progressed. These were the guys who were charged with keeping, maintaining the archives of the war record, the Kriegsarchiv der Marine. And that's the largest collection, and that's where most of my descriptions have focused. I noticed that there was a very clear filing scheme that the German Navy archivists in World War I and immediately after had followed, and that's what I reproduced. That's what I rely on. I simply reproduce what they used, their organization, their designations, and then describe thereunder. Each file typically is, there's a title, there's a numeric arrangement. Now I have no idea, it's multiple numbers. Roman numeral and Arabic numerals run together, no idea why. But all of them arranged chronologically. And for a major subject file such as Naval Aviation matters, multiple volumes. Now each of those 4 headquarters that I mentioned, each had its own set of files about naval aviation. Again, showing they all had the interest in it, but none really controlled it so much directly, except in the case of the High Seas Fleet, which controlled the Naval Airship Division in particular. Each of these collections for the four organizations, each duplicates. There's a lot of duplication from one to the next, but each also has unique materials. There's no way of getting around having to look at all of those headquarters organizations. And here's a couple of examples I'll give you. The Reichsmarineramt, you would think, would have its most direct interest in naval aviation and the naval airships in terms of construction and planning for construction and so forth. There is material like that, but the most important thing they have, there's 4 rolls of film reproducing 9 volumes, which is the most complete operational record of airship operations through the war, arranged purely chronologically. Excerpts from the war diaries of each individual U-boat, airship, betraying my own interest there. War diary excerpts, the operational order, a mission report, navigational charts, meteorological data, crew list, bomb loads, ballast tank listings for every airship that departed on a mission in World War I. That's all in the Reichsmarineramt records, consecutively in 4 rolls. If you're willing to get everything about airship operations, buy those 4 rolls or look at those 4 rolls, and you really have everything, except, of course, the context. Another example, the Kaiserliches Marinekabinet, the Naval Cabinet. Again, mostly interested in personnel issues, but also some interesting policy and planning before the war. Most interestingly, revealing that there were discussions about possible bombardments of Britain beginning in 1913. So the thought was there. The most concrete example I'm going to talk about, given the time limitations, are the Admiralstab files, the Admiralty staff files. And those are the ones I'm currently describing in some detail. Now, in this guide, in one page, for example, in one page, all I could do was give a summary of this 11-volume collection of Admiralty staff files on naval aviation matters. What I've done is expand what was this much description in here into, here I've got 5 pages, single-spaced, for those 11 files. And this was only through volumes 1 through 7. Okay? So I'm trying to give a more detailed description than what you would ever be able to find anywhere else, because there's no one else in the position to do this. Okay? What you find in these volumes, I want to give you some examples. What kind of information would they collect? Well, there are planning studies of potential targets in London and other cities, including directives and correspondence from the Kaiser delineating what areas in London were to be exempted from bombing, what areas should be reserved and held, criticisms of this and saying it's impossible to achieve these kinds of precise delineations of targeting in London, so discussions on that matter. Radiograms of the airships as they began their return from their raids. Of course, not knowing whether they might make it back or not to their home base, they would radio to headquarters what had happened during the raid, the assessed effectiveness of their bomb loads, defenses encountered, and that kind of thing. All of these early radiograms from the missions are in these files. No war diary excerpts, none of the mission reports themselves, just these early reports, the radiograms. There are memoranda discussing joint air operations with the German Army over combined air raids over London by both Army and Navy airships. By the way, the Army basically said, no, we're not interested in any of that. This is really almost entirely a Navy show, the bombardment of Britain and London. And that, I think, also is shown by those early documents I mentioned, going back to 1913. Reports on downed airships lost in the raids, from repatriated crewmen, British and neutral press clippings, and sometimes intercepts of British radio communications. There's a lot of intelligence on the British Naval Airship Service and on British anti-aircraft defenses, including interrogations of captured British naval aviators. Two other categories of airship-related documentation are especially worth noting in this 11-volume collection. First, letters of German businessmen and private citizens to the Navy with their own proposals as to what would be a really good target to bomb in Britain, what kind of factories, what kind of bombs to use, incendiary bombs, and so forth, which demonstrate the popular investment in the German population in the war effort and on Gott strafe England. But one private German citizen's missive especially stands out. There's a lengthy memorandum by Ferdinand Graf von Zeppelin on the use of his invention and his own recommendations for the air campaign against England, which he composed in January 1960. And that's not mentioned in here. So this is a file that apparently Mr. Robinson didn't get to see. The second category of documentation that's found here, again in the 11 volumes, consists of intelligence information concerning the effectiveness of the airship raids. We don't see a systematic evaluation of that effectiveness. That's one of the things that's still missing, and I'm still looking for it somewhere else in German Navy files. As possibly it's significant that I'm not finding it. But there's a tremendous amount of raw intelligence gathered on how effective are these raids? What are we accomplishing? These reports come from intelligence agents in Britain. Whether they've been turned or not, I don't know. But repatriated German civilians and prisoners of war who returned to Germany and who can offer some observations. British and neutral press clippings again. And postal intercepts of British prisoners of war. Especially letters from wives and family members to British soldiers in captivity describing the effects of the raids, all of which are duly excerpted and forwarded to intelligence for their value. Now this not only gives us a good documentation of German intelligence methodology in World War I, but it also reveals, and this is to me the most important, the contradictory evidence they were getting about the effectiveness of their air raids. You look through these files, there is no single message that's coming through. There are a lot of people, a lot of especially British and Americans in Britain whose letters are being intercepted. In one case, there's a radiogram being sent from London to New York. That was intercepted and included in the file. They're all saying these raids are not accomplishing anything militarily. All they're doing is outraging the British public. You're killing a lot of civilians. You're not really destroying any military targets. There's no really military objective being achieved here. Other letters would claim that there's a severe morale and psychological effect of these bombings, that they are effectively terrorizing the British civilian population, which is seemingly one of the goals of the campaign. So again, lacking an evaluative report balancing this, what we see here is the Germans are getting contradictory information about whether they're achieving anything or not, just in these files. Now, in addition to information on airships, the same 11 volumes, they're not limited to airships. They're dealing with all naval aviation matters. They also include documentation of German naval aircraft operations in Flanders, including many individual flight reports of individual aircraft that are carrying out missions in Flanders, along the coast, and even carrying out bombing raids on southeastern England. How many people know about the land-based Flanders aircraft attacks on southeastern England during that first Battle of Britain? Okay, we're knowledgeable, but how many people outside know about that other aspect of this first Battle of Britain? Now, other Admiralty staff files, other than those 11 volumes I've just been discussing, cover a range of materials, all dealing with naval aviation matters, especially in secondary theaters. There's an entire file that describes the abortive effort of airship L-59 to resupply the German colonial forces in German East Africa, Tanzania today. The Admiralty staff maintained one file just on that operation in and of itself. And when it could not be carried out, the ultimate continued operations and fate of L-59 in the Mediterranean. There are collections of the German Army Air Corps publication, the Information Bulletin of the Commanding General Air Forces from March 17 to September 18. So here in German Navy files, you have copies of the German Army Air Force operations, the daily summary of all operations, losses, maintenance issues, personnel issues, awards of medals and so forth, all in German Admiralty staff files. Another file documents air operations in support of the coastal defense of the German ally of Bulgaria, based out of naval air stations in Varna on the Black Sea coast, fighting against Russian forces, and from Naval Air Station at Zante, which is in a part of what was then Bulgaria, which is now part of Greece, but which was very close to the Aegean. And among the lesser-known aspects of these operations, especially for the Zante Naval Air Station, cooperation between German seaplanes from Zante with German U-boats, particularly submarine U-33. This was a decision made since, again, you've got Navy people involved at both ends, naval air people saying, you know, we might be able to work something out if we had a U-boat stationed in the waters, the Gulf of Varna, operating behind the Salonika front. If we could work against Allied shipping that's supporting the Allied forces in Salonika, we can perhaps combine seaplane with U-boat operations. And as far as I know, that's the first practical attempt at air-submarine cooperation in history. And I'm working on an article on that, so do my own plugging here. But one example, in October of 1916, U-33 recovered the crew of one of the seaplanes that was damaged at sea in the Aegean. It was forced to land, couldn't take off again. So U-33 successfully rescued the crew. 1 month later, there was a plan, didn't quite work out, but a plan for a joint operation by one of these aircraft, one of these seaplanes from Zante with U-33 to carry out a combined attack on Allied shipping in the Gulf of Varna. The result was each made their own attacks. Instead of they weren't able to quite coordinate. But it's an interesting example of naval cooperation. And what, above all, it also points to the future of the opportunities lost to the German Navy in World War II, lacking its own naval aviation service that it had in World War I, but was denied to it in the Second World War. I'll stop with these examples of the kind of documents and historical incidents to be found, but I think you can see what stories might yet be written and what history is still there to be described of the First World War that really up till now has been overlooked and forgotten simply because of the nature of the record keeping and the transition of the German Navy files through the evolution it did in Allied hands. I'll close with this, that in time, this finding aid, as of right now, you can get this finding aid at the archives. They're supposed to have copies they can simply hand to you, free, which guarantees it won't be around very long. There is no policy for selling these in order to keep them in print those of us who worked at the National Archives and who tried to argue on that seemingly common sense approach 20 years ago lost the argument to the idea that no, we have to print them, give them away for free, and make sure they go out of print as quickly as possible. There is a plan to digitize and put on our online database the descriptions you find here. That was supposed to have been done last year. It hasn't been. None of that has been done. And we can't find out the reason why. And the form that I'm writing right now, the descriptions I'm writing right now, I don't anticipate they will be published by the National Archives, but they will be available electronically, and of course will be put up on our archives database once they decide to do it. In the meantime, it's possible that electronic versions could be put up on a website. I won't go beyond that at this point, but it is possible. And I think it should be done as quickly as possible. But certainly, as we approach the centenary of World War I, this is a field that I think you could really do a lot of work still fruitfully in. And as we know from experience in Germany, there are not that many German historians or archivists who are interested in this topic and who are interested in pursuing this. I'm certainly unaware of any work underway at present in these records. So I would say the field is wide open. You need to know German, but at least it's nearly all typed. There is some handwritten material there, but you don't have to deal with 19th century handwritten German as I had to try to cope with. Thank you, and questions?